Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are going to talk about how you can hook up an analog mixer and or analog hardware to Fender Studio Pro, or any other DAW for that matter. You guys have asked me about how I hook up this stuff, how do we route the audio in and out of the interface and all that stuff. What do I need to get started, Uncle Dave, if I want to use a mixer, an analog mixer, for my home studio setup, or maybe if I just want to add a couple of pieces of hardware to get some of that analog vibe? How do I do all of that? What do I need? And we're going to talk about that in this video. So let's find out how we route audio through analog equipment and back into Fender Studio Pro. That's what we're going to do in this video. So stick around. Okay, everybody, welcome back. So like I said in the intro, this video, we're going to talk about analog equipment and how you connect it to Fender Studio Pro and how do you get started into using it. A lot of you have asked me questions over the last few years, especially since I've, bought an SSL and have a bunch of hardware. Hey Dave, how do you hook some of this stuff up? And I was always working in the box. Now I got myself like a little analog mixer. It doesn't have to be a big analog console like this. It could be, an 8-channel mixer, like a Mackie mixer, or like an SSL Big 6, or one of those types of things, an analog mixer. Now, let's just clarify before I forget, we're not talking about like a Studio Live or a Behringer Wing where you're doing DAW control. We're not talking about that. We're talking about an analog mixer. So like I said, it could be as small as a little 4-channel mixer or an 8-channel mixer that maybe you just want to route your buses out to so you can mix with faders and get some of that analog sound, and or all the way up to a big console, and or if you wanted to hook up like just a piece of hardware. A lot of you have asked me about, hey Dave, I'm all in the box and I don't have a console and not going to get a console, but I want to run some analog equipment on my master bus and I want to run my mix out of my master bus into that analog hardware. How do I do all of that stuff? People are confused. Well, the good news is it's not as confusing as you may think. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to walk through it. I'm going to explain how this works on my system. Now, whether you have a big console and a whole bunch of hardware, or a little console or a little mixer and one piece of hardware, the signal flow is exactly the same. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And this will, by the way, will work with any DAW. But we're going to talk about Fender Studio Pro because out of all the DAWs, I find Fender Studio Pro and the previous PreSonus Studio One easy to do. And I'm going to show you why that is in a second. So what's the first thing we need? Okay, so let's talk about, let's say you have a small little mixer, let's say an 8-channel mixer, and that's all you wanted to do. You just wanted to route some audio out to your mixer and then back into Fender Studio Pro. So now whenever we're dealing with analog equipment, just kind of a concept you have to kind of visualize, and you got to kind of imagine. And I'll try to put the image on the screen here so you can kind of see this. I'll follow along. So I created an image here so you can see how this works. So the basic workflow is this, and then we'll talk about specific pieces. Okay, so you have a DAW, right? So let's say Fender Studio Pro. You need to route your tracks out of Fender Studio Pro, your audio tracks, okay? You got to route it out of your analog outputs of your audio interface. Okay, so this is step one where we need to consider. So let's say you wanted to route your 8 stereo groups. Okay, let's just say you wanted to do that. You would need to have a minimum of 16 quarter-inch outputs on your interface. 16 meaning either 8 stereo, right? So stereos left and right would be 2 channels, right? Or 16 mono, right? On an audio interface, you're not going to have stereo analog outputs. Typically, they're going to be mono. So if you had 8 stereo groups, you would need 16 mono direct outputs. So the very first thing you have to think about is when we're routing audio out of our DAW, however many channels of audio we want to route out, we have to have that amount of analog outputs on our audio interface. Okay, most standard audio interfaces, the 1U rack systems, whether it's a Focusrite or some of the Fender Quantums or whatever, normally they'll have, if you have like 6 or 8 inputs, preamps, you'll usually have the same amount of outputs, right? So you may have like a Quantum with 8 inputs and you'll have 8 outputs, 8 analog outputs. That means you have 8 mono outputs. That means you have 4 stereo pairs or 8 individual mono tracks. So on that particular example, you would only be able to route out 8 mono audio tracks or 4 stereo pairs, right? So you got to think about that. So the first thing you got to think about is what exactly do you want to route out of your DAW? Okay, so we'll step back to that in a second. So we're routing our audio out of Fender Studio Pro, and I'm going to show you how you set that up in Studio Pro, and it'll work for any DAW in a minute. It's going to go out of your analog outputs on your audio interface. We just talked about that, right? And then it's going to go to your analog equipment. So in this example, it goes from Fender Studio Pro to my audio interface, which is an Analog Galaxy 64. We'll talk about the 64 I/O in a minute. And then it comes to my mixer, my SSL console, okay? This has 64 channels of input, okay? There's 64 faders on this particular console, okay? So then it goes from the interface to my mixer, okay? If I didn't have a mixer and I just wanted to send it, let's say, to a stereo, I'm gonna use a stereo compressor and an EQ, for example, okay? Then it wouldn't go to the mixer, it would go to the hardware, okay? So it goes out of the interface into whatever analog hardware you have, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Then it goes through that analog hardware, and it has to come back into your audio interface, okay? Now the mix is done, it's gotta come back in on a stereo pair, and we have to print that mix or those tracks back into Fender Studio Pro, which again, I'll show you in a second how you set that up. Okay, so if you look at the image that came up on your screen, we have a hybrid mixing signal flow, little flow chart that I created here. So it goes out of the DAW, into the interface, into the console and or outboard gear or both, depending on what you have. Then it's got to go back into the audio interface on the input side, and then it has to be printed back in to your final mix so you can export that for the world to hear with all that analog goodness printed on your mix, okay? So that's the basic signal flow, okay? So let's talk about, again, the DAW. How many tracks do you want to route out? And I'm just going to show you my system, and then you can just change the numbers for the amount of inputs and outputs that you would need. Okay, so as I said, I have my audio interface is an Analog Galaxy 64, which has 64 analog outputs, mono tracks, right? 64 mono. That coincides with, coincidentally enough, my SSL console here, which has 64 mono inputs, 32 long faders, 32 short faders, okay? So it has 64 faders on it, okay? So the Galaxy 64 has 64 outputs. My console has 64 inputs. It's no mistake that those two numbers match. Right? When I was buying my audio interface, I wanted to look and say, well, how many channels can I mix on my console? Well, I have 64 that are available to me. I may not use all 64. I may only use 24 on one song, and the next project may have 32, and the next one may have 48, or the next one may have 64. But nevertheless, I matched up my audio interface to the amount of inputs that I wanted to mix with on my console, and that happens to be 64. So the very first step before we get to the other analog equipment is we got to get the audio out of Fender Studio Pro out of our audio interface, right? And then into our console. So how do we do that? We do that in Fender Studio Pro in the I/O matrix. So if we come over here in Studio Pro, you can just come up to here. You can go to preferences if you want. There's many ways to get there. Audio setup, song setup, and here is our I/O matrix. And this is why I like Fender Studio Pro or the old PreSonus Studio One. It's the same look. It looks exactly the same. I like this kind of a grid system that makes it really easy. Now every DAW will do this the same. We'll do this a little different, but the concept is exactly the same. Logic, Pro Tools, Cubase, Ableton, Reaper, they all have an I/O setup where you can set up your outputs, as many as you need to go out of your audio interface, right? But I like this layout. I've always liked this layout because the way the grid is set up. So you'll see here that across the top we have inputs and we have outputs. Let's talk about the outputs first. So the first thing I want to do, I want to route my audio, all my tracks in my session, I want to route it out 64. I want to be able to route it out to my console, right? So along the outputs here, you'll see for this particular session, this is just a little drum session where I'm only using, I think, 14 or 15 tracks on it, but the concept is the same. Whether I was using all 32 or all 64 faders, the concept's the same. So I came in here and I created outputs. These happen to be all mono outputs, so I have mono outputs. You'll see on track 1 I have a kick in, I have a kick out, a snare top, a snare bottom, all the way down through track 14. This is a 14-track session where I have down to my rooms, right? My room microphones. And you'll see across the top here, for example, kick 1, you'll see I have an output, a mono output. And you'll see that on my particular audio interface, output number 1 in Fender Studio Pro is really output number 9, physical output number 9 on my audio interface. And that's because of some things that I'm doing here with audio and video as I create courses and live stream and such. For you, output 1 should coincide with output 1. So if track 1 is your kick drum track, right? You're gonna route it out. Track 1, you would route it to output number 1 on your audio interface, your physical outputs, the actual 1/4-inch jacks, right? So pretend like output number 9, pretend that is output 1, okay? Just follow me for a second. Then you'll see my kick out is gonna be output number 2, output number 3, so on and so forth, all the way down to output, hold on, made a little mistake there, to output number 14. Okay, so you'll see this little matrix here on how this kind of works. So the M and this little block stands for mono. If I created a stereo output like I did up here where it says video print, and again, you won't have that, that's just from my rig, from my live streaming rig, you'll see it has a left-right because it's a stereo output, okay? But in this particular session, they're mono tracks, they're all monos. If you had a stereo track, you can create a stereo output, okay? Once you have all of that set up, that's step 1, is creating your IO matrix, creating your outputs, okay? So this means that the audio, and I'm gonna show you how you set it up in the actual session in a second, you're gonna send each one of these tracks out these individual outputs on the audio interface, okay? That's what we're gonna do. So and then we're gonna close this for a second, okay? So once we've done that, then we come down to each individual track here, and you'll see the output here is the first output that I created, the kick, right? So I would route each one of my tracks in this little drop down to the appropriate output that I just created in that IO matrix, right? You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way out to track 14 here. That's where my particular session ends in this particular example. So now I've routed each one of these tracks out of the physical outputs on the audio interface, right? And out of that audio interface, I have the being connected to the inputs on my console, right? So if we go back to our little graphic that you'll see pop up on the screen, that is going to go to the inputs of my analog device. In my case, it is my SSL here. You could have a little mixer, doesn't matter, to the inputs. So those 14 tracks, 1 through 14, are physically plugged in from the output of the interface to the input of my console. Makes sense? Makes sense, right? So out of the audio interface, out of the Galaxy 64, 14 outputs to 14 inputs, okay? Set up in the IO matrix, and then you route out each individual track to those tracks, to those outputs that you just created. And then when I hit play, you won't hear this, but you'll see it on my meter bridge. If you'll see I hit play, now you'll see, if you look here, you'll see it. You'll see the signal coming in on all 14 of those tracks. Okay, so that means right now, nothing is playing in the DAW. It's all being routed out of my interface to my inputs here. Okay, that's step 1. So now, again, if you only have, say, 8 tracks you wanna route, you would need an audio interface that has 8 direct outputs, 8 analog outputs. If you had 32, you would need an audio interface that would have a minimum of 32. Okay, so you gotta make sure that however many tracks that you wanna route out, you have to have that amount of direct outputs on your audio interface. And then from the audio interface, you're plugging it into that analog gear, in this case, the console. Now, let's get back our graphic here. I'll put our graphic back up on the screen and I'll follow along with you here. Okay, so now the audio's in the console. Now, in my particular setup, and you could as well. Now, let's say we wanted to plug in a compressor or an EQ, all these beautiful racks of hardware. You'll see that we have an insert point where we can insert via a patch bay. On any one of our individual 14 tracks, I can insert a piece of gear, let's say a compressor, right? On my particular mixer, there's an insert button that I can turn on and off. If I turn it on and I enable it, that allows me to patch in a piece of analog gear via my patch bay. And now the signal goes from the analog console to the insert, right? So let's say track number 13, I want to route out to a compressor. Track number 13 now I hit the insert button, I patch in my compressor, and now my compressor is on track 13, okay? Any analog mixer typically will have an insert for something like that. Almost all of them will, no matter how small or how large they are, okay? Then the audio goes through the compressor and then it comes back into the console, right? Makes a loop, okay? And then it goes to the output of the console, right? The outputs of the console, right? Everything gets summed down, right? This is a 32 channel mixer, or in this case, 14 channels are going to my main output on my mixer, right? So I'm mixing all my tracks, summing it up, and it's coming out to a 2-track stereo left and right, just like it is when you're working all in the DAW. Your main output, my main output on my SSL or on your console, your analog mixer, now has to be routed back into your audio interface. If you look at our little graphic here, stereo, I called it the stereo mix return. You need 2 channels, left and right, on your audio interface called analog input, right? So we had an analog output for all the individual tracks coming out of the DAW, going into your analog hardware. Then out of your analog hardware, 2 channels, left and right, stereo pair has to go back into your audio interface on the analog inputs. Right, so if you have 8 outputs on your audio interface, you're going to have at least 8 inputs. That's typically how it is. Every audio interface will be a little different, but however many direct analog outs you have, you will typically have the same direct audio ins, but you only need 2 in this particular example. And then that is going to print, that input is your mix, right? It's your mix, and that is going to print in on a stereo track back into Fender Studio Pro. Okay, so let me show you how that works here in a second. So now in Fender Studio Pro, you'll see down here I have a stereo track called a print track here in yellow. And this print track is routed to that pair of inputs on my audio interface, that stereo pair. In my case, it's stereo pair 1 and 2. I'll show you. Remember, we'll go back to our analog our I/O setup, and now instead of looking at the output tab, we're going to look at the input tab. And you see this right here, print track? So print track here, that is my analog inputs, okay? And for you, it would typically say 1 and 2. Just like on the outputs, mine says input 35, 36. Don't worry about that. Again, that's just the way this rig is set up for multiple workflows. But in your example, in most people's example, your analog inputs 1 and 2, your print track will be under 1 and 2, okay? Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense, okay? So then, once you have that print track, you create yourself a stereo print track in your DAW, right? Right down here, it's in yellow. And my input now is the print track. This print track in represents what? It represents this, right here, print track in, the input that I created, okay? So I hope it's all making sense to you, right? And now when I play back my mix through my console, you'll see it print in. Let me turn on all my external hardware and let me show that to you here in a second. Okay, now all my hardware is on so you can see this. So once again, if I play back this audio, I'm going to turn down the volume so you don't hear it so I can just talk to you. But you'll see on my console, you'll see the audio, right? And now look at Studio One. See here on the print track, we're seeing audio coming back in. And if I open up the inputs pane here in Studio One, right here, here's our print track that we created in that matrix, right? Here is the stereo print of these 14 tracks going through my mixer, through my analog hardware, to the 2-bus, to the print track here in Fender Studio Pro, okay? And, let me stop this for a second. And the way you would now print your mix is I would arm this to record. Watch this, okay? I'm gonna arm this to record like you would record any track, right? You got your mix, you got your EQ, everything going. You're listening to it, you go, that's the way I want it to print. I like that sound. We hit record. And look what happens in Studio One. Or Studio Pro, sorry. Right? Here we are. So now we're printing that mix in real time, and that's the way you have to do it when you're working with analog gear. It's all in real time. Okay, that's one of the things you got to be aware of. Now we are printing that mix that is going through the console, through all the external hardware behind me that I have patched in, any insert points that I might have. It's being summed together, coming out of my SSL to the inputs, the two left and right inputs on my Galaxy 64, and now it's being printed back into Fender Studio Pro. Stop this. And then this print track becomes your final mix. So the way you would export that now, if you wanted to, is I would solo this, so it mutes all the individual tracks. I would set my in point and out point, right, with my markers. And then I would go to session, where is it here? Export mix down. And I would mix this down just like I would if I was working all in the box of plugins. And because you only have the print track soloed, that's what's going to output as a WAV file, MP3, or whatever file that you choose. And now that becomes your final mix. Does that make sense? I know it may sound a little confusing. There's a lot going on there. So let's put our graphic back on our screen again, and let's just review this quickly one last time. Okay, so it starts with your DAW. In our case, Fender Studio Pro. Okay, you want to create in your I/O matrix however many outputs that you want to send out of Fender Studio Pro, which are going to be dictated by what hardware you have, by your audio interface and how many analog outputs you have. And more importantly, what are you trying to run it to? Are you running it to a console with lots of faders? Or are you just running it to, let's say, an EQ? Let's say you just wanted to run your EQ, you wanted to run just the mix out of Fender Studio Pro, and you wanted to just go to a compressor and then back in. Well, in that case, you would be just routing your main output in your DAW or in Fender Studio Pro. You'd be mixing it all in the box. You'd be routing the main output out to that hardware compressor and then back in. So in that particular case, you would only need two analog outputs on your audio interface, left and right for your main output. Goes to the input of your compressor in this example, and then the output of your compressor would go back into the audio interface on analog input 1 and 2. And you would still print it exactly the same way. So step one is determining, well, what kind of hardware do I have? Do I have a mixer? Do I have hardware? Do I have both? What do I have? How many outputs am I going to send out of my Fender Studio Pro? That will dictate how many outputs, that you need on your audio interface. From the audio interface, those physical outputs get plugged into your analog equipment to the input side, whether it's a console, whether it's hardware, or both, right? In this example, it goes to my SSL. All the audio runs through the SSL. I insert any outboard gear that I want, right? And then I do my mixing, I do my EQ, I do all my stuff here on my console, and then it goes to my 2-bus output on my console. The output of my 2-bus on the SSL goes to the input of the stereo return mix on the audio interface, right? So I have two left and right. And that gets assigned to a print track in Fender Studio Pro, and then I record and print the mix in real time. Okay, so if you take a look at this thing, or if you pause the video and take a screenshot of this little graphic that I've had up here on the screen as I'm talking you through it, you'll see it's really quite easy. It goes out of the DAW, out of your interface, into your hardware, out of your hardware, back into your interface, into Fender Studio Pro. That's how you hook up analog gear. It's not as complicated as it seems. The more equipment you have, the more stuff that you have, it's the same whether you're using just 2 channels or whether you're using 64 channels. The concept is exactly the same. But the main ingredient to all of this is, regardless of how much analog outboard gear you have to make sure that your audio interface has enough analog outputs to get to that analog gear. And this is where sometimes if you only have 8, let's say you only have 8 outputs on your audio interface, most interfaces you can buy 2 of them and daisy chain them together. So now you have 8 and 8, you have 16, right? Or you can get some, like in my case, the Antelope, which has 64 all in one audio interface, but there's ways to do it with multiple interfaces, regardless of which one you're using, by the way. So I hope that answers some questions. I know it's a long-winded thing, but people have asked me about it and they can't wrap their head around it. And as you talk through it, I could see where it gets confusing if you don't understand it. But if you print out this this hybrid mixing rig little graphic here, and you just pause the video and just take a screenshot out of it. If you look at this, you say, oh, it's really not that complicated, right? It's not a whole lot different than when you're using a guitar with a pedal board, an amp, and an effects loop for your reverbs and your delays, and then out to your cabinet. It's a similar kind of workflow if you're a guitar player. It's not that difficult. It's just coming out of the DAW, out of your interface, into your analog hardware, out of your analog hardware, back into Fender Studio Pro, and that's how you do it. So, if you have any specific questions, please leave them in the comments below and let me know. And if you want to see how I mix with all this analog gear, and then more importantly, not only mix on the analog gear, but then talk to you about how you can use plugin equivalents to kind of cop and mimic this workflow, and most importantly, the sound, you can check out Mixing with Analog Style Plugins Made Easy. I'll leave a coupon code in the description box below to give you 25% off of that course. And you can also check out the hybrid mixing series that I have as well. Even though I'm working all with analog gear, I talk to you about what the plugin equivalents are. So we have two types of courses: Mixing with Analog Style Plugins Made Easy, which is all in the box, all with these analog style plugins that mimic and emulate the old classic gear, and how you can set up your DAW just like an analog workflow in the box. And then the hybrid mixing series, which shows you how we're doing everything I'm talking about in this video, and if you don't have all this stuff, how you can get the same kind of sound just using your plugins. So let me know in the comments below what you thought about this video, and if you have any more specific questions around this topic, I'd be glad to try to help you. And until the next video where we talk about more really cool things in the studio, I've been Dave with homerecordingmadeeasy.com. Thank you so much for watching, everybody, and I'll see you guys in the next video.